Let's cross to Stockholm. Historian Lars Tragardh joins us there. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24. The Sweden Democrats in third place. Is this a seminal shift for your country?
Well, I think many people actually hoped or feared that it would be more decisive than it has been. In many ways, not that much has changed since the last election. They have gotten, maybe 3-4% more of the vote, but they didn't pass the 20% threshold. The moderates and the Social Democrats did reasonably well. So I would say it's not quite as overwhelming as some people had anticipated.
You wrote a book back in 2006, Is the Swede Human? It was republished again in 2015. Gosh, when you think back to 2006, when you first published it, your country's changed a lot.
Well, it has in some ways, but in other ways not. I mean, if we are, let's say, focusing on questions around immigration, which has, of course, been the big issue in the last few years since the refugee crisis in 2015, the story about Sweden really, in a certain way, is about continuity. Since the Second World War, Sweden has sported both a strong national welfare state and has emerged as what is sometimes called a moral superpower, that is to say, taking a kind of an outsized responsibility and role in terms of development aid, receiving refugees. So we've had a fair amount of immigration since the 1940s. And it's been quite successful. And in some ways, you want to ask yourself why that has been the case, which is not really the question that's being asked now, because there is a sort of alarmist tone, both in the Swedish debate and especially in foreign countries where, most of the time you hear about burnings and lootings and all sorts of trouble. But one interesting question to ask is really, what is it that makes the Swedish society work pretty well, even with a great deal of immigration? And here I think there are like two answers to that question. One is that Swedish national identity is not particularly organized around ethnic ideas of national identity. It's a much more civic ideal that revolves around citizenship and democracy. The second thing, and that's what that book that you mentioned was all about, is a very individualistic society. It's based on a very strong alliance between the state and the individual citizen. And it also revolves around a very strong egalitarian principle that also is connected to the idea that everybody works. So it's a social contract, to paraphrase Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that is based on this idea of citizens that work, pay taxes, and receive social rights. So it is in many ways a very open society, assuming, however, that everybody contributes and work. And the problem with immigration in recent years has been that there's been a shift away from labor immigration towards large numbers of refugees that require much longer time to enter effectively the Swedish workforce. And without entering the workforce, there is very little chance for them to actually be fully integrated into Swedish society. So this is the key challenge that we have right now. Some of that has to do with numbers and speed of immigration, and the other one is this shift from labor immigration to refugee immigration.
Lars Tragardh, one final question for you, because you mentioned it well. In so many ways, Sweden works. The unemployment rate, literally, the unemployment rate is much lower than it is here in France. The economy is doing well. But there's this gap, it seems, and these elections show it, between what is happening and perception. Why is it that wide, that gap?
Yeah. Well, that's a very, very important and good question. And my simple thesis is this, right? That we've had these two ideals that have been operating side by side. One very national, and the other one, very open to the international. So we see in Sweden both the nationalist and the globalist ideals as being very central. Now, the problem is that over the last 20, 30 years, since really the fall of the wall, we've seen how the political parties in Sweden, aside from the Sweden Democrats, have been increasingly dominated by what we can call the globalists. Who take a very negative view of the nation state, either from a neoliberal perspective, celebrating the market society, or from a left-wing perspective, see the nation as a xenophobic, exclusionary in terms of a relationship to human rights ideals. And what has meant is that the Social Democrats in particular, who's been a dominating party, that used to be a very powerful proponent of what we can call democratic nationalism, they have sort of created a new space for alternative forms of nationalism that the Sweden Democrats have begun to occupy as the Social Democrats has become more and more globalist or internationalist in its orientation. And that shift has been taking place slowly since the early 1990s, and it has opened up for a whole new playing field politically. And the big question now is whether the mainstream parties, both the Social Democrats and the center right, will be able to find a better balance, right, between the ideas around the nation state on the one hand, and on the other hand, their aspirations to also be a player on the global stage. In a way, I think this is something you'd recognize in France, right? Where
sure.
Macron, for example, tries to both be a French patriot and a good European.
Lars Tragardh, historian Lars Tragardh, your book is called Is the Swede Human? Many thanks for joining us from Stockholm.